My Uncle Paul had always been an enigma. He wasn't the type to engage in small talk or join in on family activities. His visits, while frequent, were always marked by his quiet, distant nature. Whenever he came over, he would immediately retreat to the guest room, shutting the door behind him with a soft click. Once inside, he would remain there for hours, a solitary figure. His preference for solitude was something that became a given in our home. We hardly saw him except at mealtimes, and even then, he kept to himself. He would sit at the farthest end of the table, quietly consuming his food, rarely uttering a word. There was an unusual habit he had, one that always struck me as odd yet somehow fitting for his mysterious personality. Uncle Paul would sip his tea slowly, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as though lost in a realm of thought that no one else could enter. It was as if he was contemplating things beyond our reach, things that we could never hope to understand. I often found myself watching him during these moments, wondering what went on in his mind. Was he thinking about something from his past? Was he troubled by some hidden worry? Or perhaps he was simply savoring the peace and quiet that seemed so rare in his life. Despite the fact that we were family, Uncle Paul was like an unsolved puzzle. He never shared any stories about his life, and no one ever dared to ask. There was something about him, an invisible wall, a quiet plea for solitude, that made it clear he preferred not to be disturbed. It wasn't that he was unfriendly or rude, far from it. He just exuded a sense of detachment, as though he was a man who had lived many lives and kept their details locked away. Sometimes, I wondered if he was hiding something, but there was no evidence. Just an unsettling feeling that lingered in the back of my mind. The curiosity would often swirl in my thoughts whenever he visited. What kind of life did he lead outside of these visits? Did he have friends? Was he as lonely as he seemed? But each time, I found myself too hesitant to ask. It felt like there was a boundary I could not cross, a line drawn in the sand that I didn't want to disturb. And yet, I couldn't help but feel there was more to him than met the eye. He was like a book with a locked cover, and I, a desperate reader, was left wanting to unlock its pages. Little did I know that soon, I would learn more about Uncle Paul than I ever expected, and in a way that I could never have imagined. It was a warm Sunday afternoon when Uncle Paul came to stay with us for a few days. The sun bathed the house in golden light, and the chirping of birds outside made it feel like the perfect, serene day. My mom was especially excited about his visit. She and Uncle Paul had always shared a special bond, and she was eager to spend time with him. She bustled around the kitchen, preparing his favorite dishes and chatting about how much she had missed him. But for me, there was a sense of unease that lingered. There was something about Uncle Paul that always made me feel on edge. It wasn't that he was unkind, nor was it anything he had said. It was the way he carried himself, with a quiet, almost palpable aura of mystery. He had this look in his eyes, as if he saw the world differently, or perhaps as if he knew something the rest of us didn't. It wasn't something I could explain, but it always made me nervous. On previous visits, I had always tried to keep my distance, not out of dislike, but because I never quite knew how to behave around him. He wasn't like other uncles, who cracked jokes or brought us presents. Uncle Paul was reserved, quiet, and always seemed deep in thought, as though he were carrying a secret too heavy to share. I never quite understood it, but I didn't dare ask. That day, however, was different. I watched him from a distance, as he sat outside on the porch, his expression serious as he stared out at the landscape. There was a weight to his silence, a depth that I couldn't quite grasp. When he finally came inside, he greeted everyone with a small, almost imperceptible smile before retreating once more to the guest room, as if it was the only place where he truly felt at ease. Something felt off, like there was a change in him that I couldn't pinpoint. By the third day of his visit, I began to notice something unusual. Dinner was served as usual, but Uncle Paul was nowhere to be found. It was odd, considering how much he usually enjoyed our meals together. The family was talking, sharing stories and laughter, but his absence felt unsettling. Mom, however, didn't seem to think much of it. She knocked on his door to check on him, but when he didn't respond, she simply assumed he was tired from the long journey and needed rest. She left him alone, thinking nothing of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The unease gnawed at me throughout the evening. My curiosity, like a whisper I couldn't ignore, grew stronger. Later, as the house settled into a comfortable quiet, I found myself standing outside his door. My younger brother was busy in the living room, stacking blocks into an unstable tower, while Mom read her book and Dad watched TV. The house felt warm, familiar, but there was a restless tension inside me that I couldn't explain. I had to know what was going on. When I couldn't stand the suspense any longer, I decided to check on him. I waited until the noise of the household faded and everyone seemed distracted in their own way. Taking a deep breath, I walked quietly down the hallway, my heart pounding with uncertainty. I reached the guest room door, my hand hovering just above the doorknob, my stomach twisted in knots, my mind racing with questions. What if he was just resting? What if it was nothing? Still, I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned the knob, careful not to make a sound. The door creaked ever so slightly, just enough for me to peer inside. My heart skipped a beat as I hesitated, unsure whether I should push forward. What if he caught me? What if he turned around? My mind whirled with the possibilities, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I leaned closer, my breath shallow and steady, trying to calm myself. But that's when I heard it, quiet, soft sounds that didn't quite make sense. My thoughts raced, trying to comprehend what I was hearing. As I peered through the crack in the door, my eyes widened in shock. What I saw left me utterly stunned, unable to process it. Time seemed to stretch, like the moment was frozen in place. As my mind struggled to make sense of what I was witnessing, I wanted to look away. I wanted to leave and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but my body refused to move. My heart pounded in my chest, louder than ever before. There was Uncle Paul, sitting at the edge of the bed, his eyes closed, lost in whatever world he had created for himself. But it wasn't just his posture, it was his hand, and what he was doing that made my stomach lurch in ways I couldn't begin to describe. Shock, embarrassment, confusion all hit me in a rush, leaving me rooted to the spot, unable to breathe properly. I was paralyzed with uncertainty, completely unsure of what to do next. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to pretend that I hadn't seen anything, to ignore the moment and walk away as though nothing had happened. But my body betrayed me. It refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, as if the very floor beneath me had turned to stone. My eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding in front of me, my mind desperately trying to make sense of the confusion, the unexpectedness of what I was witnessing. But before I could process it fully, it happened. The floorboard beneath me creaked under the weight of my standing still, and the noise shattered the tense, oppressive silence in the room. It felt as though the sound cracked through the atmosphere like a bolt of lightning, jolting me from my frozen state. Uncle Paul's eyes shot open, wide with alarm. In that instant, our gazes locked, and it felt like the world had stopped spinning for a moment. His eyes were filled with a combination of shock, fear, and panic, as though he had been caught in the middle of something he believed no one would ever discover. His expression was so raw, so vulnerable, that it took me a moment to process just how deeply this moment was affecting both of us. A wave of conflicting emotions surged through me. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the unbearable tension in the air, but no words came out. My throat felt parched, as though I had swallowed sand. My legs shook beneath me, and I could feel the weight of the moment in every fiber of my being. I was frozen, unsure whether I should flee, apologize, or simply disappear into thin air, wishing the moment would vanish as if it had never happened. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating, every second stretching into what seemed like an eternity. We stood there, staring at one another, neither of us sure of what to do next, the silence wrapping itself around us like a heavy cloak. It was the kind of silence that presses in on your eardrums, the kind of quiet that makes your own breathing feel deafening. The world around me seemed to dissolve, and I became hyper-aware of every small detail, the pounding of my heart in my chest, the warmth creeping up my face, spreading rapidly like wildfire. As embarrassment and confusion surged together, my skin felt hot, and I couldn't escape the feeling of being exposed, like every secret I had ever kept was suddenly laid bare in that one awkward moment. My heart raced so loudly that I was certain Uncle Paul could hear it echoing in his ears. Uncle Paul moved quickly, his hands shaking as he reached for a blanket to cover himself. His eyes were wide with panic, his gaze never leaving mine, as if he were desperately trying to gauge my reaction. "Wait, don't go," he said, his voice a breathy whisper, full of tremors. There was an undeniable desperation in his words, something far more fragile than anger or defensiveness. It wasn't just guilt, it was something deeper, something I couldn't quite name at that moment. It was vulnerability, mixed with fear, maybe even shame. His voice cracked under the weight of whatever it was he was carrying. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to turn around and escape from this incredibly awkward and painful situation. But there was something in his voice, something so unguarded, that kept me rooted to the spot. It wasn't the anger I expected, nor was it the defensive tone I had anticipated. It was a kind of rawness, plea that I couldn't ignore. Despite every instinct telling me to leave, I couldn't move. And then, as if against my own will, I stepped further into the room, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me, my hand slowly reaching for the door to close it behind me. The click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud, as though the sound itself was accusing me of staying, of not walking away. My stomach churned with unease, and yet, a part of me, an involuntary part, needed to stay. I had to know what was going on. What was he hiding? Why was he so afraid? What had led to this strange, uncomfortable moment? I stood there, arms crossed tightly over my chest, as though I could somehow shield myself from the uncomfortable tension in the room. My posture was defensive, yet I didn't know how to move or where to go. I felt out of place, unsure whether to stay or leave, but too curious to simply walk away. "I'm sorry you saw that," Uncle Paul finally murmured, his voice barely audible. He lowered his eyes, as if ashamed to meet mine, the weight of the moment too heavy for him to bear. "This isn't something I wanted anyone to see, especially not you." His words were quiet but charged with an intensity that left me speechless. There was something so disarmingly honest about his apology that it took me by surprise. The rawness of his vulnerability hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for, and I found myself unable to respond. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I was caught between a whirlpool of emotions, embarrassment, pity, and a strange sense of curiosity that gnawed at me, urging me to understand, to know what lay beneath the surface of his actions. I didn't know how to respond. My hands fidgeted nervously at my sides, as if they were betraying the storm of thoughts inside my head. I stood there, still trying to make sense of the situation, unsure of what to say or how to react. The silence between us grew heavier, and all I could do was stand in it, not knowing how or when this moment would finally come to an end. "Why? Why were you doing that?" I finally asked, my voice trembling with a mix of confusion and disbelief. He let out a heavy sigh, the kind that seemed to carry the weight of the world with it, and ran his fingers through his hair. "It's complicated," he said, his voice quieter now, as though he was choosing each word carefully. "Lately, I've been feeling very lonely. You know, sometimes people turn to things like this when they're trying to cope, when they feel lost or like no one gets them. It's not right, and believe me, I'm not proud of it." I was silent, staring at him, my mind struggling to process the words he had just spoken. Loneliness. The word hit me hard, and for a moment, I found myself at a loss. I had never once thought about what Uncle Paul might be feeling deep down. To me, he was always the composed one, the strong, self-assured man who seemed like nothing could ever shake him. He had always appeared untouchable, like someone who had it all together, and I never questioned it. But now, as I looked at him, sitting in front of me, he seemed different, vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. He was, in that moment, human, just like everyone else. "Why don't you talk to someone?" I asked, my voice soft but earnest. "Maybe Mom, or a friend." You don't have to carry this all by yourself." He looked away for a second, his eyes distant as if searching for the right words. "It's not that simple," he finally replied, his voice filled with a quiet frustration. "Sometimes, you feel like no one will understand. It's not that I don't trust people. It's just, when you're trapped in your own mind, it's hard to explain. You don't want to burden anyone with your problems. You feel like you're drowning, but you're too ashamed to ask for help." His words hit me harder than I expected. I had heard similar things before, in moments of weakness, when I felt overwhelmed by the pressures of life. But hearing them from him, of all people, Uncle Paul, who had always seemed like a pillar of strength, made me realize something profound. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't exempt from the struggles that everyone faces, those internal battles we all try to hide. He had been suffering quietly, and for years, I had no idea. It made me wonder how many other people I knew were carrying invisible burdens, wearing masks of composure, when beneath the surface, they were struggling just as much as I had at times. We sat in silence for a few moments, both of us lost in our thoughts. He had opened up in a way I hadn't expected, and it felt like the weight of the conversation was sinking in. "You know," I said cautiously, still processing everything. "I felt like that before too, like no one would understand, like I was stuck in my own head with no way out." Felt strange to say that out loud, but somehow, it didn't feel like I was burdening him. It felt like a shared moment of understanding. "I didn't know you were going through something like this. I just thought you were always fine." Uncle Paul gave a small, rueful smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I guess I hid it well, didn't I?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's the thing. We all have our demons, but it's hard to admit them, especially when you feel like you're supposed to be strong for everyone else." As the night went on, we talked for hours. He opened up in ways I had never expected. He told me about the depression he had been silently battling for years, how it was like a constant cloud hanging over him, casting a shadow on every part of his life. He spoke of the deep loneliness he had been feeling, the sense of being disconnected from everyone around him, even when he was surrounded by people. He described how, despite his efforts to keep it together, the emptiness within him never seemed to go away. There was no escape, no respite from the heaviness of it all. I listened intently, trying my best not to judge, not to make assumptions. For the first time, I saw my uncle not as the stoic figure I had always known, but as a man who, like so many others, was struggling with his own demons. And that was when I realized just how much strength it took for him to be vulnerable, to let me see this side of him. But what happened next left me utterly stunned. In the midst of our conversation, after everything we had shared, Uncle Paul casually looked at me and asked, without warning, if I would like to have a feel of it. I froze. My heart began to race as I tried to process the words, unsure of what he truly meant. The question was so unexpected, so out of place, and yet, part of me wanted to understand. I hesitated for a moment, my mind swirling with a mix of confusion and curiosity. But before I could stop myself, I found myself nodding. I didn't even know why. I just knew that something inside me wanted to know more, to understand what he was asking in that strange, cryptic way. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. That single word, "yes," would change everything. I had no idea at the time, but that one simple affirmation marked the beginning of a profound shift in my life. The air between us felt different, charged with an energy that neither of us had expected. That night was a blur, like a dream wrapped in fear, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of curiosity. Uncle Paul, who had once seemed like a distant, almost mythical figure, became human to me. He wasn't just the mysterious relative I had always avoided. He was a person with real struggles, someone who was just as vulnerable as anyone else. As I left that night, the weight of our conversation lingered. The confusion I had felt earlier faded into understanding, and I began to see him in a new light. He wasn't perfect. Far from it. He wasn't a villain, nor was he someone to be feared. He was simply a man who had been carrying a heavy load, And now, I saw him for who he truly was. That night, though strange and awkward, taught me something valuable. Taught me that sometimes, the hardest and most uncomfortable conversations can lead to the most meaningful connections. I learned that my uncle had his own battles, his own scars, and that I wasn't alone in mine. His pain resonated with mine, and in that moment, we weren't so different after all. From that day forward, my perception of Uncle Paul changed. I began making an effort to check in on him more often, not out of suspicion or fear, but because I genuinely cared. I would sit with him, share stories, listen to his advice, or simply enjoy his company in silence. Each moment with him became an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to understand that life is messy, and sometimes, we need the people around us to help us make sense of it. I had learned that it was okay to let my guard down, to trust, and to form connections, even when those connections started in unexpected and awkward ways. Uncle Paul was no longer just a distant relative. He became a part of my life, a reminder that even the hardest moments can lead to growth, healing, and understanding. Though I may never be able to explain it fully, the impact of that night, and everything that followed, will stay with me forever. Thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. If you find the content useful and interesting, don't forget to like, share, and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new videos. Their channels will update attractive, inspiring, and useful content for you. Click the bell icon to receive notifications as soon as there are new videos. The biggest motivation for us to continue developing. Thank you and see you in the next videos.